The cold concrete walls of cell block D had become James Morrison's unwanted home for the past 6 years. The former detective sat on his thin mattress, using a small piece of chalk to mark another day on his wall. Day 2190. Each mark was a reminder of his innocence, a testament to the justice system that had failed him. The morning light barely filtered through his small cell window, casting long shadows across the floor. At 45 years old, Morrison's once dark hair had started showing streaks of gray, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Yet it wasn't age that had worn him down. It was the weight of separation from his daughter, Sarah. "Morrison. Mail call." The guard's voice echoed through the corridor. A small envelope slid through the bars, landing softly on the floor. Morrison recognized the neat handwriting immediately. It was from Sarah. His hands trembled as he opened it, pulling out a recent photo of her at her high school debate competition. She had grown so much. He had missed so many precious moments. 6 years ago, Morrison had been at the top of his game. As the lead detective in the narcotics division of the Boston Police Department, he had orchestrated one of the biggest drug busts in the city's history. The Santos cartel had lost over $50 million in drugs and cash. It should have been his crowning achievement. Instead, it became his downfall. The memory of that fateful day played in his mind like a broken record. He had walked into the precinct on a regular Tuesday morning, only to be met by internal affairs officers. They had evidence. Fabricated evidence, showing him tampering with case files and accepting bribes from drug dealers. Before he could even process what was happening, his badge and gun were taken away. The trial had been a circus. Witnesses he had never met testified about secret meetings that never happened. Bank accounts he'd never owned were presented as evidence of his corruption. The Santos cartel had orchestrated everything perfectly, but he couldn't prove it. Even his own partner, Detective Mike Reynolds, had turned against him, claiming he had suspected Morrison's corruption for months. Sarah was only 10 when they took him away. The image of her crying in the courtroom, clutching her mother's hand as the guilty verdict was read, haunted his dreams. His ex-wife, Karen, had tried to keep Sarah away from the whole mess, but the damage was done. Their daughter watched her hero being labeled a criminal. Morrison's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his cell. It was Officer Wilson, one of the few guards who treated him with respect. "You doing okay today, Morrison?" Wilson asked, pausing at his cell. Morrison nodded, carefully tucking Sarah's photo under his pillow. "Just another day in paradise, Wilson. Heard you're being transferred to Blackgate next week," Wilson said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Maximum security. That's rough." The news hit Morrison like a punch to the gut. Blackgate was 3 states away. The visits from Sarah, already rare, would become almost impossible. The thought of being even further from his daughter made his chest tighten. Later that night, as Morrison lay on his bunk, he pulled out his most precious possession, a small notebook filled with letters he'd written to Sarah but never sent. Each page contained words of love, explanations he couldn't give, and hopes for her future. He had written in it every night for 6 years, holding on to the dream that someday she would read them and understand. Tomorrow, he would request a meeting with the warden. One last visit with Sarah before the transfer. That's all he needed. Just one chance to hold his little girl, who wasn't so little anymore. What he didn't know was that this simple request would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. As darkness fell over the prison, Morrison added another entry to his notebook. "My dearest Sarah, they're moving me to Blackgate next week. I don't know how to tell you this. The thought of being further away from you breaks my heart. But remember what I always taught you. The truth always finds its way to the light. Keep believing in me, sweetheart. Your dad loves you more than life itself." Outside his cell, the prison settled into its nighttime routine. Security lights cast harsh shadows, and the occasional sound of doors clanking echoed through the corridors. But inside cell block D, a wrongfully convicted father held on to hope, unaware that his daughter had already set wheels in motion that would soon shake the very foundation of his conviction. The warden's office was unusually quiet that morning as James Morrison sat in the metal chair, his hands folded neatly on his lap. Warden Phillips studied the request form in front of him, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at Morrison. "A special visitation request." The warden's voice was neutral, giving away nothing. You understand these are rarely approved, especially this close to a transfer. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. Sir, I'm being moved to Blackgate next week. My daughter. She's 16 now. The distance would make it almost impossible for her to visit. I'm just asking for one last chance to see her. The warden's eyes softened slightly. In his 15 years running the prison, he had seen thousands of inmates, but Morrison was different. He had never caused trouble, always followed the rules, and maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that was rare behind these walls. You are a cop, Phillips said, removing his glasses. You know how the system works. Special visits require extensive paperwork, security clearances. Please, Morrison interrupted, something he had never done before. Sarah's growing up without me. I've missed so much already. Just 30 minutes, that's all I'm asking for. Outside the office window, the prison yard was coming to life with the morning exercise period. The sound of basketball games and muffled conversations drifted up to them, a reminder of the world Morrison had been forced to adapt to. The warden picked up his phone, pressed a button, and spoke quietly. Jenny, get me Sarah Morrison's visitor file. He turned back to James. I'll need to review her previous visits, check for any incidents. There haven't been any, Morrison said quickly. She's only been able to visit twice in the past year. School, distance, her mother's work schedule. It's been difficult. A knock on the door interrupted them. The secretary entered with a thin file and handed it to the warden. As he flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raised slightly. Your daughter, he said, reading from the file. She's in the honors program at her high school. President of the debate club. Morrison couldn't help the small smile that crossed his face. Yes, sir. She's working hard, despite everything. The warden closed the file and sat back in his chair. For a long moment, he studied Morrison, seeming to wrestle with his decision. Finally, he reached for his stamp. Thursday, he said, pressing it firmly on the request form. You'll get 1 hour, not 30 minutes. But Morrison, he leaned forward, his expression serious. This has to go by the book. Any problems, and it ends immediately. Morrison felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. Back in his cell, Morrison sat down to write a letter to Sarah, his hands shaking slightly with excitement. He had so much to tell her, so much to ask about. But as he put pen to paper, a nagging worry crept in. How would she react to seeing him in this place? Would it hurt her more than help? Officer Wilson appeared at his cell door during afternoon rounds. Heard you got approved for the special visit, he said, keeping his voice low. That's good news, Morrison. Yeah, Morrison replied, folding the letter carefully. Wilson, can I ask you something? If you had a daughter, would you want her to see you like this? The guard was quiet for a moment. My old man was in prison when I was growing up. He finally said, never wanted to see me, said he was protecting me. You know what? That hurt more than seeing him in here ever could have. Morrison nodded, letting the words sink in. He looked at Sarah's photo again, at the strong, determined young woman his little girl had become. Maybe Wilson was right. Maybe what she needed wasn't protection from the truth, one more chance to know her father still loved her, still fought for her. As night fell over the prison, Morrison added one final line to his letter. See you Thursday, sweetheart. Your dad has so much to tell you. What he didn't write, what he couldn't know, was that Sarah had even more to tell him, information that would change everything. But for now, in the quiet of his cell, a father simply looked forward to holding his daughter one more time, unaware that their upcoming visit would become the turning point in his fight for justice. Thursday arrived with a nervous energy that filled the prison's visiting room. James Morrison sat at the metal table, his orange jumpsuit stark against the gray walls, waiting for the moment he would see Sarah. His fingers drummed anxiously on the table's surface as he watched the heavy door. When it finally opened, his heart nearly stopped. Sarah walked in, taller than he remembered, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail secured with a blue hair tie. She wore her school uniform, a navy blazer and plaid skirt, and carried herself with a confidence that made his chest swell with pride. Dad. Her voice broke slightly as she rushed forward. The guard stepped closer, but Sarah remembered the rules, slowing her approach. Their hug was careful, monitored, but filled with 6 years of missing moments. Morrison noticed she was almost as tall as him now. When had that happened? When they pulled apart, he saw tears in her eyes that matched his own. "Look at you," he said softly, taking in every detail of her face. "You've grown so much." They sat down across from each other, and Sarah's hand reached up to adjust her hair tie. Her movement seemed deliberate, almost practiced. "Dad, I have so much to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison noticed something different in her eyes, a determination he recognized from his own reflection years ago when working tough cases. She leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice low. "I've been doing research," she said, glancing quickly at the guards. "About your case, about the Santos cartel." Morrison's heart rate quickened. "Sarah, no. That's dangerous. You shouldn't." "Dad, listen," she interrupted, her fingers nervously playing with her hair tie again. "Remember Tommy Chen, your old informant?" The name hit Morrison like a thunderbolt. Tommy Chen had disappeared just before his trial, another convenient coincidence that had helped seal his fate. "He's alive," Sarah continued, her words coming faster now. "I found him. He's been hiding in Seattle, and he's ready to talk." Morrison felt the blood drain from his face. "How did you?" "Sarah, you have to stop this. These people are dangerous." Sarah shook her head, and in one smooth motion, removed her hair tie. As she did, Morrison caught a glimpse of something small and metallic woven into it. A USB drive. "I'm not stopping," she said firmly. "I've documented everything. The money trails, the fake witnesses, the doctored evidence. It's all here." She set the hair tie on the table between them, making it look like a casual gesture. Morrison's police instincts kicked in. He covered the hair tie with his hand, sliding it closer. "Does your mother know about this?" "No," Sarah admitted. "But I'm not alone. Detective Rodriguez has been helping me. He never believed you were guilty." Morrison remembered Marcus Rodriguez, a young officer he had mentored. The fact that he had been watching over Sarah brought a lump to his throat. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. "We found irregularities in Judge Harrison's offshore accounts. Large deposits made right before your trial. Dad, this goes higher than just the cartel." A guard's voice cut through their conversation. 5 minutes. Morrison felt panic rise in his chest. There was so much more he needed to know, so many warnings he needed to give. But Sarah's expression stopped him. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She was her father's daughter, with the same sense of justice that had driven his career. "Trust me, Dad," she said, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "We're going to fix this." As they stood for their final hug, Morrison felt the weight of the hair tie in his palm. 6 years of helplessness began to crack, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "Be careful, please." Sarah held him tighter. "Love you too, Dad. Stay strong. Things are about to change." As he watched her walk away, Morrison carefully palmed the hair tie. His daughter had grown into someone remarkable, brave, smart, and determined. But she had also put herself in danger, and that thought terrified him. Back in his cell, Morrison carefully extracted the USB drive from the hair tie. His hands trembled as he held it, knowing it contained the key to his freedom, but also fearing what Sarah had risked to get it. As night fell over the prison, a father's pride battled with his fear, unaware that at that very moment, Sarah was setting the next phase of her plan in motion. Detective Marcus Rodriguez sat at his desk late into the night, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The contents of Sarah's USB drive were more explosive than anyone had imagined. Alongside him, retired Detective Frank Walsh, Morrison's former partner before Mike Reynolds, rubbed his tired eyes. "How did a 16-year-old girl gather all this?" Walsh muttered, scrolling through financial records that showed suspicious payments to key witnesses in Morrison's trial. Rodriguez smiled grimly. "She's James Morrison's daughter. Remember how he could connect dots nobody else could see? She's got that same gift." Their makeshift investigation headquarters was set up in Rodriguez's basement, away from prying eyes at the precinct. Evidence boards covered the walls, and boxes of case files littered the floor. This wasn't an official investigation. It couldn't be, not with how high the corruption seemed to reach. The door opened, and Sarah walked in, carrying 3 cups of coffee. Dark circles under her eyes showed she'd been sleeping as little as the two detectives. Tommy Chen called again, she announced, setting down the cups. He's scared, but he's willing to make a sworn statement about how the cartel threatened him into disappearing before Dad's trial. Walsh leaned back in his chair. We need more than just Chen's word. The cartel's lawyers will tear him apart on the stand. Look at this, Rodriguez said suddenly, pointing at his screen. Judge Harrison's daughter bought a house in Miami 3 days after the verdict. Purchase price: $1.2 million. But according to her tax returns, she was making $40,000 a year as a teacher. Sarah quickly pulled out her notebook, adding this to their growing list of suspicious activities. Over the past months, she had filled 3 notebooks with similar details, a web of corruption that had ensured her father's conviction. A sharp knock at the door made everyone freeze. Rodriguez reached for his gun, but relaxed when a familiar voice called out, "It's Karen." Sarah's mother entered, looking worried. "Sarah, you need to come home. It's almost midnight." "Mom, we're close to something big," Sarah protested. "Look at what we found about Judge Harrison." "I know, honey," Karen interrupted, her voice softening. "But you have school tomorrow, and if anyone realizes what you're doing..." She left the threat unspoken. Rodriguez stood up. "She's right, Sarah. We'll keep working on this. Go home, get some rest." As Sarah gathered her things, Walsh's phone buzzed. His face darkened as he read the message. Mike Reynolds was just found dead in his apartment, apparent suicide. The room fell silent. Reynolds had been Morrison's partner, the one who had testified against him. His death now, just as they were uncovering the truth, couldn't be a coincidence. "It's starting," Rodriguez said quietly. "They know we're getting close." Karen pulled Sarah closer, maternal fear evident on her face. "This is exactly what I'm worried about. These people are killers. And they put my father in prison." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "We can't stop now. Dad's being transferred to Blackgate next week. Once he's there..." Walsh cut in, his voice firm. "We're not stopping, but we need to be smarter. More careful." He turned to Rodriguez. "Call your contact in internal affairs. It's time to bring them in." Rodriguez nodded. "First thing tomorrow. And Sarah," he looked at her seriously, "no more solo investigating. You've done amazing work, but from now on, you work only with us. Deal?" Sarah looked ready to argue but caught her mother's pleading expression. "Deal." As Karen drove Sarah home, the teenager stared out the window at the dark streets. Somewhere in the city, the people who had framed her father were probably celebrating Reynolds' death, thinking they had eliminated a weak link. They didn't know that a determined daughter, 2 loyal detectives, and a growing network of supporters were closing in on the truth. Back in the basement, Rodriguez and Walsh continued working through the night. They carefully organized the evidence Sarah had gathered, amazed at how thorough she had been. Bank records, surveillance photos, witness statements. She had built a case that would make any detective proud. "James taught her well," Walsh said softly, looking at a photo of Morrison and young Sarah at a police picnic years ago. Rodriguez nodded, determination setting his features. "And we're going to make sure he gets the chance to teach her more." He picked up his phone to make the call to internal affairs, knowing that with this step, there would be no turning back. The real fight for justice was about to begin. Internal Affairs Captain Diana Chen sat in stunned silence as she reviewed the evidence spread across her conference room table. 3 days had passed since Rodriguez and Walsh had brought her the case, and what started as a skeptical review had turned into a full-scale investigation. "So a teenage girl uncovered what our entire department missed?" she asked, shaking her head in disbelief. Rodriguez nodded. "Sarah Morrison didn't just find evidence. She built connections. The offshore accounts, the witness tampering, even surveillance footage that mysteriously disappeared during her father's trial. She found it all." Captain Chen picked up a photograph showing Judge Harrison meeting with known cartel members at a private club. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 days before Morrison's trial began. "This is explosive stuff. Where's the girl now?" "Safe house," Walsh answered. "After Reynolds' death, we moved Sarah and her mother into protective custody. The cartel's already made 2 attempts to break into their home." The door opened, and a junior detective rushed in, holding a stack of papers. "Captain, we found something." Remember those missing evidence bags from the original Santos cartel raid? They just turned up in a storage unit registered to former Chief Deputy Williams. Captain Chen's eyes narrowed. Williams had been second in command during Morrison's trial and had recently retired to a luxury villa in Costa Rica. Now they knew how he could afford it. "Get me a warrant," she ordered, "and contact the Costa Rican authorities. Williams isn't going to hide behind palm trees while an innocent man sits in prison." Across town, in the safe house, Sarah sat with her mother, watching the local news. The headline caught their attention. "Former police chief deputy under investigation for corruption." "It's happening, Mom," Sarah whispered, gripping Karen's hand. "They're finally looking at the right people." Karen squeezed back, tears in her eyes. The past 6 years have been hard on her too. Watching her ex-husband go to prison, raising Sarah alone, dealing with the whispers and judgment of others. But now, seeing her daughter's determination pay off, she felt a fierce pride. The safe house phone rang. Rodriguez's voice came through, excitement barely contained. "Tommy Chen just landed. He's giving his official statement right now. Sarah, he's corroborating everything you found." Back at Internal Affairs, Chen was coordinating with FBI agents who had joined the investigation. The case had grown beyond local corruption. They were looking at a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple states. "We got recordings," an FBI agent announced, playing an audio file. The voice of Judge Harrison filled the room. "Make sure Morrison goes away for a long time. The cartel's paying good money for this." Captain Chen slammed her hand on the table. "That's it. Get me arrest warrants for Harrison, Williams, and every other corrupt official involved in this frame-up. And someone get me the warden at Morrison's prison. We need to stop that transfer to Blackgate." The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. SWAT teams moved simultaneously across the city. Judge Harrison was arrested while playing golf at his country club. 3 former police officers were taken into custody. And in Costa Rica, local authorities surrounded Williams' villa. At the safe house, Sarah watched the news coverage with tears streaming down her face. 6 years of work, of secret investigations, of never giving up hope, were finally bearing fruit. "Sarah," Rodriguez called from the doorway, "there's someone who wants to talk to you." He handed her his phone. Her father's voice came through, shaking with emotion. "My brave, brilliant girl. The warden just told me everything. What you did. Sarah, I don't have words." Sarah clutched the phone tightly. "I learned from the best, Dad, just like you taught me. Follow the evidence, trust your instincts." "The warden says they're expediting my release paperwork," Morrison continued. "A few more days, sweetheart. Just a few more days." As Sarah talked with her father, Captain Chen stood in her office, watching the sun rise over the city. On her desk lay Sarah Morrison's notebooks, filled with the meticulous investigation that had brought down a corrupt system. She picked one up, smiling slightly. "We could use someone like her in internal affairs one day," she mused aloud. Outside, news vans gathered as more details of the corruption scandal emerged. But in a secure safe house, a teenage girl who had never stopped believing in her father finally allowed herself to think about a future where justice had prevailed, and her family would be whole again. The courthouse was packed on Monday morning. Every seat was filled, with reporters and spectators lining the walls. James Morrison sat at the defendant's table, wearing a suit for the first time in 6 years, provided by Detective Rodriguez. Sarah and Karen sat directly behind him in the front row. Judge Melissa Martinez, specially appointed from another district to handle the case, studied the mountain of evidence before her. The tension in the room was electric as she began to speak. Having reviewed all the new evidence, including Mr. Chen's testimony and the extensive documentation provided by Sarah Morrison, this court finds itself facing one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in our state's history. Morrison felt Sarah's hand reach forward to squeeze his shoulder. He covered it with his own, both of them trembling slightly. The depth of corruption uncovered in this case is staggering, Judge Martinez continued. A sitting judge accepting bribes, law enforcement officers fabricating evidence, and a criminal organization manipulating our justice system. This court has no choice but to overturn James Morrison's conviction immediately. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Sarah jumped up, throwing her arms around her father's neck. This time, no one tried to stop them. Karen wiped tears from her eyes as Rodriguez and Walsh clapped from their seats nearby. Judge Martinez banged her gavel for order. Furthermore, this court offers its sincere apologies to Mr. Morrison for the years of freedom stolen from him. The state will begin immediate proceedings to compensate him for wrongful imprisonment. But she wasn't finished. Bailiff, please bring in the other defendants. The side door opened, and a line of former officials shuffled in, wearing orange jumpsuits and chains. Judge Harrison, ex-Chief Deputy Williams, and the corrupt officers who had testified against Morrison all looked much smaller now, their power stripped away. The defendants before me have betrayed every principle of justice they swore to uphold, Judge Martinez declared. Their actions have not only destroyed an innocent man's life, but have shaken the very foundation of our legal system. She turned to Sarah, her expression softening. This court would also like to acknowledge Sarah Morrison, whose determination and courage brought the truth to light. Your work would impress seasoned investigators, young lady. Sarah blushed as all eyes turned to her. Morrison beamed with pride, remembering the little girl who used to play detective in their backyard. She had grown into someone extraordinary. One final matter, the judge continued. Mr. Morrison, please approach the bench. Morrison stood, straightening his tie. Captain Chen stepped forward, carrying something in her hands. By order of the police commissioner, and with the authority of this court, I hereby reinstate your badge and position with full rank and back pay, Judge Martinez announced. Captain Chen. Diana Chen stepped forward, presenting Morrison with a fresh badge and his service weapon. Welcome back, Detective Morrison. The courtroom erupted again, this time with officers in attendance standing to salute their vindicated colleague. Morrison turned to face them, returning the salute with tears in his eyes. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around the family. Morrison held Sarah close as cameras flashed and questions flew at them from all directions. Detective Morrison, how does it feel to be free? Sarah, what made you start investigating? Will you return to active duty? Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, creating a path for them. The family will make a statement later. Right now, they need time. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Morrison noticed Sarah watching the arrested officials being led to prison transport vehicles. Her expression was complex, part satisfaction, part sadness at seeing how corruption had infected the system her father had served. You know what I want to do first? Morrison asked her, drawing her attention away from the scene. What's that, Dad? Get a burger from Joey's. Remember our Saturday tradition. Sarah's face lit up. With extra pickles and those crispy fries? Extra everything. Morrison laughed. And this time, we can take all the time we want. No visiting hours to worry about. As they walked to the car, Morrison thought about the long road ahead. There would be adjustments, challenges, and healing needed. But looking at his daughter, who had fought so hard to bring him home, he knew they would face it all together. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a symbol of both injustice and redemption, a reminder that sometimes the smallest hands could tip the scales of justice back into balance. 2 weeks after Morrison's release, Joey's diner was more crowded than usual. The owner had closed it for a private celebration, and the small restaurant was filled with police officers, friends, and family. Colorful balloons decorated the walls, and a banner read, "Welcome home, Detective Morrison." Morrison sat in his old favorite booth, watching Sarah laugh with Rodriguez and Walsh over milkshakes. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of readjustment. Simple things still surprised him, using a real shower, wearing his own clothes, eating whenever he wanted. But the biggest joy was simply being able to see Sarah every day. Your burger's getting cold, Karen said, sliding into the booth across from him. Though divorced, they had found a new understanding through this ordeal. Just taking it all in, Morrison replied, picking up his burger. Sometimes I worry I'll wake up back in that cell. Karen reached across the table, squeezing his hand. This is real, James. You're home. Captain Chen arrived late, carrying a large envelope. She made her way through the crowd to Morrison's booth. Sorry to interrupt the party, but you'll want to see this. Inside the envelope was a newspaper. The headline made Morrison's heart skip. Santos cartel leaders arrested in international sting operation. The article detailed how evidence from his case had led to a broader investigation, resulting in the cartel's collapse. Your daughter's investigation didn't just free you, Chen explained. It helped us take down one of the biggest drug operations on the East Coast. Sarah joined them, carrying a plate of fries. Her eyes widened at the newspaper. Is it really over? Thanks to you, kid, Chen smiled. The FBI wants to offer you an internship when you're in college, by the way. They're quite impressed with your investigative skills. Morrison watched his daughter's face light up. She had grown so much, become so strong. Yet sometimes, when she slept on the couch while watching movies with him, you could still see traces of his little girl. Joey, the diner's owner, called for everyone's attention. Hey folks, I've got something special here. He wheeled out a large cake decorated with a police badge design. To the best cop I know, and his amazing daughter. As people gathered around for cake, Walsh pulled Morrison aside. The commissioner wants you to head up a new unit, he said quietly. Special investigations, focusing on police corruption. You'd be perfect for it. Morrison looked around the diner, at his colleagues who had stood by him, at his daughter who had never lost faith, at the community that had welcomed him back. I'll think about it, he said. Right now, I'm just enjoying being here. The celebration continued into the evening. Officers shared stories, laughed over old memories, and made plans for the future. Sarah sat next to her father, listening to tales from his early days on the force, soaking in every moment. Dad, she said during a quiet moment, remember when you used to tell me that justice always finds a way? Morrison nodded, putting his arm around her shoulders. I never forgot that, she continued. Even when everyone said to give up, I knew you were right. A commotion at the door drew their attention. Tommy Chen had arrived, looking nervous but determined. He had been essential in Morrison's release, and the FBI had arranged protection for him. I had to come, Chen said, approaching Morrison. Had to see you free with my own eyes. Morrison stood, embracing the man whose testimony had helped break the case. Thank you, Tommy, for doing the right thing. Thank your daughter, Chen replied. She found me when I was hiding, convinced me to come forward. She's got your spirit. As the evening wound down, Morrison and Sarah stood outside the diner, looking at the stars, something they had both missed doing during his imprisonment. What now, Dad? Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. Morrison smiled, remembering all the dreams he'd had in his cell about moments like this. Now we live, sweetheart. One day at a time. They watched as their friends and family left the diner, each stopping to share a hug or kind word. The night was warm, the stars were bright, and for the first time in 6 years, both father and daughter felt completely at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Morrison's return to duty, Sarah's college preparations, the ongoing legal proceedings against the corrupt officials. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply a father and daughter, together again, their bond stronger than ever. 1 year later, the police academy auditorium buzzed with excitement. Detective James Morrison stood at the podium, adjusting his newly pressed uniform. As head of the department's new Integrity and Justice Unit, he was giving the keynote speech at the graduation ceremony. In the front row, Sarah sat proudly, now a freshman at Boston University majoring in criminal justice. Next to her, Karen beamed, holding a bouquet of flowers. Rodriguez, Walsh, and Captain Chen sat nearby, all having played crucial roles in rebuilding the department's reputation over the past year. When I first joined the force 20 years ago, Morrison began, his voice strong and clear, I thought I knew everything about justice. But life has a way of teaching us its most important lessons through our hardest moments. He paused, looking at the eager faces of the graduating cadets. True justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about standing up for truth, even when you stand alone. It's about believing in what's right, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. In the audience, Sarah smiled, remembering the lonely nights spent piecing together evidence, the countless dead ends, and the moments of doubt that had almost overwhelmed her. Her father caught her eye and gave her a slight nod. Some of you might know my story, Morrison continued. 6 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit, but that's not what defines me. What defines me is the unwavering faith of a young girl who refused to give up on her father, who taught me that sometimes the strongest warriors for justice are the ones we least expect. The room fell silent, hanging on his every word. Among the graduates was Tommy Chen's son, inspired to join the force after witnessing the power of truth to change lives. Today, You join a department that has been reborn. The corruption that once infected these halls has been cut out. The trust we lost has been rebuilt, step by step, case by case. And it all started because one person refused to accept injustice. Morrison stepped away from the podium to pin badges on the new officers. Each one stood a little straighter, understanding the weight of responsibility they were accepting. When he reached Jung Chen, they shared a meaningful look. Both their families had been transformed by the events of the past year. After the ceremony, Morrison found Sarah surrounded by new officers asking about her internship with the FBI's Criminal Investigation Division. She had become something of a legend in the department, the teenage detective who cracked an impossible case. "Ready for lunch?" Morrison asked, approaching the group. It was Saturday. Their standing date at Joey's hadn't missed a week since his release. As they drove to the diner, Sarah noticed they were taking a different route. "Dad, Joey's is the other way." Morrison smiled mysteriously. "Small detour." They pulled up to a building site where construction workers were putting the finishing touches on a new structure. A sign read, "Future home of the Morrison Center for Investigative Justice." Sarah's eyes widened. "Dad, is this?" "The department approved it last week," Morrison explained. "A training center for young investigators focusing on wrongful conviction cases. And," he added with pride, "they want you to help develop the curriculum during your summer breaks." Sarah jumped out of the car, running to read the sign up close. The center represented everything they had fought for, a place where truth and justice would be pursued relentlessly, where other families might find the help they needed. At Joey's later, over their usual burgers and fries, Morrison watched his daughter excitedly planning programs for the new center. Karen joined them, bringing files from her new job as a victim advocate, another positive change born from their experience. "You know," Morrison said, "when I was in prison, I used to dream about moments like this. Just sitting here, being together. But reality is even better than my dreams." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We made it, Dad. We really made it." Outside, the afternoon sun shone on a city transformed. The Santos cartel was gone, corrupt officials were serving their sentences, and a new generation of officers was rising, inspired by a story of unwavering love between a father and daughter. As they sat in their favorite booth, sharing fries and making plans for the future, Morrison realized that his greatest achievement wasn't solving cases or earning commendations. It was raising a daughter who understood that justice, like love, was worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The end.